Hello! Or shall we say huzzah? Huzzah! There's always been a drink in my hand when I've said huzzah at any time in the past. All right, anybody still lingering in the lobby? Okay. So much fun. Welcome, everyone. Thank you all so much for being here at the Firehouse Center for the Arts. And of course, this is the final lecture in Newburyport's Road to Revolution series. I'm Bethany Groff Dureau. I'm the Executive Director of the Museum of Old Newbury. And I want to thank the Firehouse for helping us make this happen in particular. Thank you very much for being such a wonderful host. The events that take place from now until the end of June, which is upon us, that commemorate and celebrate the 250th anniversary of the start of the American Revolution, are sponsored by the Massachusetts Office of Travel and Tourism. There we go, right there. As part of the Mass 250 promotional campaign, we are very, very grateful to have been one of the communities selected to tell our revolutionary story, and we are hoping we get a chance to do part 2. So we shall see. Huzzah! We have partnered with the Cushing House Museum as our primary partner in this grant. We're very fortunate to have such strong historic resources and organizations in this community. And they are holding the bag for the last 2 big events, so we'll talk about that in a minute. We've partnered with Lowell's Boat Shop, the Newburyport Chamber of Commerce. Yay! And I have to say also, St. Paul's Episcopal Church has been absolutely come in clutch. We have been lucky enough to be selling out of these events and running out of space in the museum. And St. Paul's welcomed us with open arms, as the Firehouse has as well. So we're very, very lucky to have such great friends and neighbors. Thank you so much, all of you. And thank you for turning out to these things. We can't do this without you, so thank you so much. All right, I'd also like to thank my long-suffering board of directors, many of whom you may recognize from this slide, my staff, who puts up with a lot, including Shelley, who made all that food out there, and our amazing interns and board members who hauled it around and brought it to you, and of course, my husband. This is an actual photograph of James bringing a case of Ipswich Ale into the Firehouse tonight. Here he is. Okay, these are actually all slides from the 1930 Tercentennial parade. So anyway, those are the only non-offensive slides I can show you, or less offensive. All right. Although there is a dead duck in that one, which may be very offensive. It has been a wild few months. Since February, we have convinced 1,944 of you to come to our lectures on tea protests, Rev War weapons, fortifying the harbor, Newburyport's black citizens. That's just a couple. We shot some muskets. We terrified the neighbors of St. Paul's Church. Had a fashion parade, wandered through some revolutionary gardens. And my very favorite thing, of course, we visited numerous burying grounds. We're going to visit another one on Friday night, and then Sawyer Hill. There's a special one next weekend at Sawyer Hill. And I got to hold Lee's flashlight. I am not worthy. It was great fun. Our next 2 big adventures and the grand finale of this part of our commemoration of the Revolution, they are both next week because James Russell is a sucker for punishment. They are the Road to Revolution exhibit opening, which is on the 26th. Is that correct? Have we updated that since that slide? Okay. And the Road to Revolution parade. Okay, we're going to do something that somebody did at a conference. Take out your phone, open your camera app, point it at that from where you're sitting, and you can go right to the website for the parade. I swear, you will feel so cool. Focus on that QR code there, or you can just read the information on the other side, if that's all too much. Okay.
Just strained my bank account.
Oh. That is not a QR code to my bank account, I promise. But you're welcome to make a donation. Okay. Do you all have it? Isn't it cool? Okay. You are currently, if you manage to pull that up, on Newburyport250.org, which is part of this process. We have a Revolutionary War timeline, various events, and other things on that website. So get in there a little bit, check it out. We're going to keep updating that all through all of the commemorations of the 250th. I would like to point out that in my personal archives, Oh, no, wait, hold on. This is James Russell's, this is his float for the parade that's coming up. And this is the siege of the Battle of Louisbourg, and he's asked that he play that guy so he can finally get some rest. Okay, I would like to point out from my personal archives that, in fact, West Newbury did a full Bunker Hill reenactment. Did you know that, Alex? 3,000 people in West, look at this screen. 3,000 people in West Newbury.
Looks good.
1975. And this was the picture taken by my great aunt Emily of all the fuss. So there you go. We've been thinking about Bunker Hill for a very long time. But back to details here. In Newburyport, one of our treasures in this community is this lovely object here. We chose as our emblem of the Road to Revolution the Richard Dole powder horn. It was carved with the British symbols of a lion and unicorn as the symbol of this long road to revolution and the shifting loyalties of the late 18th century. Made on June 29th, 1759, the powder horn accompanied Richard Dole when he served as a British citizen during the French and Indian War. 20 years later, Dole joined the 10th Massachusetts Regiment of the Continental Army. He had served in the Newbury Militia before then and likely fought at Bunker Hill, although the records are a little bit sparse on that one. But we know he saw action at Valley Forge, Saratoga, Brandywine, and Germantown. This world must have seemed very upside down to people like Richard Dole. And in fact, you'll hear about a lot of people who had fought alongside as British citizens and are now, taking the other side. In Newburyport, no one person to me better represents those shifting loyalties than General James Wolfe, who died at the moment of victory on the Plains of Abraham with Richard Dole near him in 1759. William Davenport served with him, and when he returned home, he named his new tavern after his hero, General Wolfe. Wolfe Tavern, in one form or another, was a fixture in this town until it was demolished in 1954. So without further ado, I would like to invite Newburyport's only 7.5-member sea shanty group, the Portermen, to come up on stage. They are going to share a little tune about General Wolfe. Thank you, gentlemen.
You want to talk about this? Bethany, you want to talk about this?
No, go ahead.
No, I don't know. You just don't sing it.
Do your best.
So this is can you guys hear me okay? Yeah. Okay. So this is a song made from a poem that the poem's accredited to General Wolfe that supposedly he wrote on the day before he died on the Plains of Abraham in Montreal, Quebec. And so somebody took to music. It's basically about we might die tonight or tomorrow, but that's okay.
You're soldiers.
You're soldiers, that's what you're about. So, yeah, that's it.
How stands the glass around? For shame ye take no care, me boys. How stands the glass around? Let mirth and wine abound. The trumpets sound. The colors they are flying, boys, to fight, kill or wound. May we still be found, content with our heart fare, me boys, on the cold, cold ground. Why, soldiers, why should we be melancholy, boys? Why, soldiers, why, whose business 'tis to die? What sighing fight? Damn fear, drink on, be jolly, boys, 'tis he, you and I. Cold, hot, wet, or dry, we're always bound to follow, boys, and scorn to fly. 'Tis but in vain, I mean not to upbraid you, boys. 'Tis but in vain for soldiers to complain. Should next campaign send us to him that made us, boys, we're free from pain. But should we remain above
awfully nice to have a house band, isn't it? What else do you know from the French and Indian War? Anything?
We're working on that for next time.
All right, there will be encores aplenty. Where can folks see you next, Porterman?
Nowhere.
Okay, well, we're keeping expectations low. All right, well, the Portermen have a very active presence on Instagram and Facebook, so sign up and they'll tell you where they're going to be next. So thank you, and thank you, Porterman. They went out to refill their beers. So I will also tell you that not only does that, I heard that song and I thought this has to be performed by the Portermen. Isn't that kind of a lovely song? And then to find out it was written by General Wolfe the night before he died. It was also apparently being, or allegedly, being sung by Hamilton the night before his duel with Aaron Burr. So it has another little interesting link to American history. So speaking of links to American history, I'm going to get off the stage. It is my great pleasure to introduce Alex Cain, who started this whole shebang with the first lecture in this series and did such a wonderful job, and we're so grateful that he agreed to come back and close us out with a review of the Battle of Bunker Hill. I will also tell you, of course, this is the Benjamin Dole powder horn from the Museum of Old Newbury, and if you would like to come and meet it after the show, I will be accompanying it very carefully like this. So thank you all. Please welcome Alex Cain.
Thank you very much. Who do you got to? Don't steal my ticket. How is everyone? Excellent. You know, very, very tough act to follow the Portermen. I could sing some Whitesnake songs, but I don't think you guys want to hear those.
Yes, please.
Thank you. So I'm absolutely thrilled to be back here. I've been looking forward to this lecture, particularly since yesterday was the 250th anniversary of the Battle of Bunker Hill. So the opportunity to come here and talk about this particular battle, as well as highlight Newburyport's role in it, was very exciting. So with it, I wanted to start off, just give a brief overview of the battle. Battle obviously was fought on June 17th, 1775. It was the third military engagement of the American Revolution, the first being Lexington and Concord, and the second being the Battle of Chelsea Creek, which took place what is now East Boston in May of 1775. Although it was technically a British victory, it was very costly for the British, as we'll see later in my lecture. It also sent a message to the Crown, as well as the other American colonies, that Massachusetts provincial forces had the necessary resolve and willingness to fight Crown policies, Crown military incursions, and it actually resulted in a boost to British morale, to American morale. And of course, as we'll see towards the end of the lecture, Bunker Hill actually had long-term consequences beyond the fight itself, both politically, militarily, and socially as well. So what we are going to discuss tonight, I want you to make sure you're comfortable. We're going to have a lot of fun. But we're going to talk first about the prelude to battle, what is leading up to the Battle of Bunker Hill. We will talk about the Americans actually digging in for the fortification. I think it's very important to recognize Newburyport is part of the far end of the Merrimack Valley. The Merrimack Valley, Bunker Hill was the Merrimack Valley's fight, as we're going to see. So Newburyport played an important role. The other communities along the Merrimack Valley River area also did as well, particularly when they were initially starting to dig in for the fight. We will talk about mobilization of troops, both American and British. This is where we will focus on both Newburyport's Little's Regiment, as well as Newbury's Gerrish's Regiment. We will talk about the burning of Charlestown. Over the last month, I have had the opportunity, I have had two drawings of Charlestown, that are contemporary drawings that really aren't that well known, that I'm going to share with you tonight, that show the extent of the burning and the damage of that particular battle. We will talk about the first attack, the second attack, and then we'll hit the third and final attack, and we will discuss the aftermath, particularly in regards to Joseph Warren. And then, as I always say, if you behave yourselves, and if you're nice to me and compliment my awesome hair, I may let you ask some questions. Now, usually if you've seen my lectures before, normally I have a very sarcastic comment that comes after a dedication or an inspirational quote. But this is different, and this is actually going to be probably in my career as a historian, the only time you'll probably ever see me do a dedication to someone. Last week, excuse me, I had the unfortunate that I lost my mother. My mother fought a very courageous battle against ovarian cancer, but fortunately she went peacefully, surrounded by loved ones. And when Bethany got the news that my mother had passed, she said, "Do you want to do this? I can stand in for you, or we can reschedule or something like that." And I spoke with my family, I spoke with my father, and I decided that I wanted to go forward with this lecture. And there were 3 reasons why I wanted to go forward with this lecture, particularly in honor of my mother. First of all, my mother was a dedicated educator. Prior to the arrival of my sister or I, she was a high school English and literature teacher for Billerica High School. Education was very important to her. She instilled that in both my sister and I as we grew up. Once we hit high school and she was sick of us, she went back and became a professor at Northern Essex Community College, where she worked with first-generation college students and immigrants who wanted to pursue the American dream. Secondly, she was a very proud Lowell girl, but her number 2 favorite place was Newburyport. She adored everything about Newburyport, particularly your commitment to historical preservation and the arts. Her granddaughter was heavily involved in this particular theater, so it was very important that I do that. And finally, I pride myself as being a historian. Next to probably my wife and kids, my mother was my biggest cheerleader. She was my editor when I was self-publishing a couple of books. She is the one who encouraged me to go beyond the military analysis of the American Revolution. She particularly enjoyed when I put up my blog posts or when I would do various lectures, and always wanted to hear it. As a funny story, my blog is called Historical Nerdery. My mother called me up very early on when I launched Historical Nerdery, and she started really to lay into me in true Irish Catholic fashion. She thought that my blog was historical nudity. And as a result, I was running some 18th century sex site or something. But once she realized what I was doing, she was my biggest cheerleader, and anytime I would put a blog post out, anytime I gave a lecture, she was always there cheering me on. She would call me up, we would always talk about it. So this lecture tonight is dedicated to my mom, and I assure you that I'm going to give 150% for this particular lecture. Thank you. So let's talk about before the Battle of Bunker Hill. I am going to assume that everyone paid attention at my last lecture. You passed my quiz. Okay, good. We still hate Amesbury, okay, but we'll get back to that. The first thing is, I want to start off with the Siege of Boston. So the Siege of Boston began on April 20th, 1775. And basically what you had was a half-moon arc that went around what was the town of Boston. It started north roughly about Medford or Chelsea, swung down to Cambridge, down to basically the Roxbury area, and finished up in the Braintree area. The Siege of Boston can be broken down into 3 categories collectively. The first one was organizational, where General Artemus Ward and then General Washington were trying to organize the Continental Army and ensure that it was properly stationed and properly supplied. The second area was what I deal with interdiction efforts. And this ultimately is where Newburyport came in. Maybe we'll talk about it in phase 2 of our Road to Revolution. We actually saw coordinated efforts both on the land and sea to cut off supplies from the British troops and the civilians who were trapped there as well. And that's where the Battle of Chelsea Creek falls into play, which was the second engagement. Battle of Chelsea Creek was basically an interdiction effort to prevent British foraging operations in the Boston Islands. And then the final phase was essentially the efforts to envelop Boston and force the British out of the town. If they can't starve them out, then the goal would be militarily to force them out. And this is where it ended with the British evacuation, but it began with the Battle of Bunker Hill. So in the days leading up to the Battle of Bunker Hill, roughly around June 14th, 1775, General Gage convened his military officers. In the months before Lexington and Concord, he had 3 generals who arrived in Boston, General Clinton, General Howe, and General Burgoyne. And he organized a meeting because he realized when he took a look at the topography of the American siege lines, there were two major hills that overlooked Boston. One was Bunker Hill to the north, the second one was Dorchester Heights to the south. And so General Gage realized that if the Americans were to occupy either of those particular hills, they would be forced to evacuate Boston. They could no longer hold that particular town. So they decided we need to move on a military operation. And there was this great debate between the four generals what exactly they should do or how they should do it. General Burgoyne noted during the meeting that it was absolutely necessary to become masters of these heights. It was critical that they did. The original plan they came up with was this very complex and coordinated plan, particularly for 18th century standards. There were going to be two-prong attack that was going to happen at the same time. The first prong would be basically led by General Howe. General Howe was going to row across and land in Charlestown and take Bunker Hill. The other attack was going to be a land attack, which was going to be led by Burgoyne and Clinton. They were going to punch through Roxbury Neck and then seize Dorchester Heights. And it was decided that they were going to initiate this operation before the end of the month of June. Well, as is famous for Massachusetts back in 1775, someone had loose lips and somebody was sharing information. On June 15th, roughly about 24 hours after this plan was mapped out, rebel intelligence already was aware of what was going on. They became aware that there was this dual attack, and they realized that Americans had to respond to this particular attack. And what they decided is they were going to focus on Bunker Hill. General Artemus Ward, who is the overall commander of the American forces at this time, he is Washington's predecessor to the siege of Boston. He ordered Colonel William Prescott. Colonel William Prescott, who was from Middlesex County and a French and Indian War veteran, was ordered with approximately 1,000 troops to march on Bunker Hill. According to the colonel, he received the orders the evening of June 16, 1775, approximately about 9 or 10 o'clock at night. He was to take his regiment, as well as Bridges' regiment, Fry's regiment, and a detachment of Connecticut troops under the command of Israel Putnam to fortify this hill. And this is where I started off my talk. Merrimack Valley comes into play. The majority of those, with the exception of the Connecticut troops, the three regiments that are going up onto that redoubt are all Merrimack Valley men. Bridges' regiment was essentially from the Lowell area down to Tewksbury. Prescott's regiment was essentially about the Westford area in Dunstable, working your way towards Lowell. And Fry's was Andover men all the way up to Salisbury men. So there's this very strong connection with the Merrimack Valley to this particular fight. Now, what happened was the Americans start digging in. You had Richard Gridley, who was an engineer, accompanied this detachment and literally mapped out the fortification that he was going to have them dig. He started putting stakes into the ground, running a rope line or a string line, and the Americans began to try to dig under the cover of darkness. Well, the question becomes, while they're digging, where to defend? You know, because ultimately, if you're familiar with the Battle of Bunker Hill is a misnomer. It's actually the Battle of Breed's Hill, because they moved down to a lower hill. Why did they actually move to that hill? Well, nobody knows. So if you do know, if you have a time machine, please let me know, because there is a big debate. Prescott, Putnam, and other regimental commanders, when they arrived at Bunker's Hill, started to have a debate. Where should we position this fortification? Bunker's Hill rose approximately 110 feet in height and basically covered the only exit route off of Charlestown. As you're going to see in a few minutes, the map. Charlestown is basically a peninsula. Charlestown is a peninsula as well. So Bunker Hill actually protected that escape route. However, they decided to march towards Breed's Hill, which is in front of Bunker's Hill, and it's a much smaller hill, but it's also within the artillery range of Boston. Now, people have asked me, is there any hill that even remotely resembles what Breed's Hill looked like in 1775. There is one hill I'm aware of, and this time I will be nice to Amesbury. If you're familiar with Woodsum Farm, Woodsum Farm's hill topographically is eerily similar to Breed's Hill. Height, layout, everything. So if you ever want to get an appreciation about the hill that the British were attacking, this is essentially that fortification.
Ignore me.
Oh, ignore you. She's getting away with the powder horn.
I'm moving it so you all can see the map.
Ah. They,
Carry on.
okay, thank you, Bethany. The New England troops went down onto this particular Breed's Hill. Now again, it's a double-edged sword, because on the one hand, they're now exposing themselves to direct artillery fire, not just from the Royal Navy, which is anchored around the Charlestown Peninsula, but on top of that, they're now within artillery range of the Royal Artillery, which has set up batteries in what is now the north end of Boston. On the other hand, however, some historians going back, why did they pick that hill? The conclusion is that perhaps Prescott or Putnam, because neither of them ever commented why they picked this particular hill, moved down. Many historians believe that they may have wanted to pick a fight, that it was their desire to position it closer to Boston to draw out the forces, to perhaps have one last battle where the British were defeated and then the British would have to sue for peace. And of course So what happened was after they decided to move down, according to Prescott, who did write an account, wrote to John Adams after the battles of Bunker Hill, he said, "We arrived at the spot, the lines were drawn by an engineer, and we began entrenchment at midnight, plying the work with all possible expedition." Well, it was Murphy's Law that it was only a matter of time before the British would detect what was going on. And at dawn, lookouts that were located both on the Royal Navy warships as well as Royal Artillery officers stationed in Boston started seeing the early stages of an earthwork going up on Breed's Hill. And as a result, they realized they were also within, these fortification was being constructed within cannon range of Boston. So as a result, these artillery placements and the Royal Navy immediately opened fire. And according to Colonel Prescott, just before sunrise, when the enemy began a very heavy cannonading. Now, Peter Brown, who is from Westford, and he is part of Prescott's regiment, he describes the process of the cannonading. So this starts about 5 o'clock in the morning, and this is going to be going off and on until about noon. And there's a reason why the cannonade, you can see Peter Brown describes that the cannons fire, they cease, they fire again, they cease, and then they start speeding up. What they are doing is two things. The Royal Navy and the Royal Artillery are called ranging their guns. They're trying to determine, they're basically trying to accurately aim the cannons at the redoubt. Cannons become much more accurate as they heat up, but also they have to cool them down so they don't explode on you, so that there's times when they're trying to rearrange the guns and also cool the guns down a little bit so they do not overheat. So Massachusetts militiaman Peter Brown, who is from Westford, would describe the ferocity of the morning bombardment. For about 5 in the morning, we not having more than half the fort done, they began to fire pretty briskly for a few minutes, then ceased but soon began again and fired for the number of 20 minutes, then ceased to fire till about 11 o'clock in the morning, when they began to fire as brisk as ever, which caused many of our young country people to desert, apprehending the danger in clearer manner than others who were more diligent in digging and fortifying ourselves against them. This goes again to the American spirit, if you think about, where they are under right now heavy artillery fire, and many of these men are actually trying to dig in, and they are trying to create this fortification. But as soon as the cannonading started, you do see some Massachusetts militiamen and some Connecticut militiamen who just bolt from the field and try to get across Charlestown Neck. Well, as the bombardment continues, British warships and gun batteries continued to bombard the position. More of the Royal Navy came onto line. They basically hugged around Charlestown Neck and began to fire on it. A lot of barges that had mobile artillery pieces on the barges began to fire as well. Prescott would later report that they were under a very warm fire from the enemy's artillery And of course, he really didn't have any artillery to return the fire. He pretty much just had infantry. There are some smattering of artillery guns, but the problem is most of them do not have cannonballs. They are actually loading their cannons with musket balls. It's almost like birdshot. And so as a result, they're not effective against artillery replacements. And he talks about how his men are starting to panic and they're getting ready to run. And of course, the men were absolutely becoming very anxious. They're starting to see particular people desert. Many of the men who were digging were under the impression, we are going to dig through the night, we're going to finish the fortification, and then someone else is going to man this fort. We're out of here. Now they're realizing, oh fudge, we're not in a good position. They're thirsty, they're hungry, they're not seeing reinforcements coming right away to support their position. They want to be off the neck and get to a safe position as possible. And we have two accounts. First of all, we have a letter, and this is where Newburyport starts to come into the picture. We have a Newburyport, John Bromfield wrote to Jeremiah Powell 2 days after the Battle of Bunker Hill, so on June 19, 1775, where he had received news about what had happened during the fight. And he talked about how the men worked exceedingly hard all night, and no refreshment had been sent to them of any kind. They were almost suffocated with dust and choked for want of liquor. Yeah, I would want some liquor too at this particular point. They had expected to be relieved early in the morning, but no relief came. And to add to the distress, they saw that the regulars were preparing to visit them. So where they're positioned on Breed's Hill, they can actually see down to the north end of Boston, and they're starting to see the Royal Navy deploy transport boats. They're being rowed across to Boston. They're starting to see regimental troops starting to form up. On top of that, going back to Mr. Brown from Westford, he recalled the morale was very quickly collapsing. We began to almost beat out, being fatigued by our labor, having no sleep the night before, very little to eat, no drink but rum. He might have wanted to talk to the other regiment to see if they could exchange. But we hazarded to get our lives to get. They were starting to grow faint, thirsty, hungry, and weary. The enemy fired very warm from Boston and from board their ships. If you think about this, at this point, the mindset in the American militiamen is, we're trapped here. We have Royal Navy, 30-gun ships, 40-gun ships, 50-gun ships, even greater, just pounding the position. The Royal Artillery is firing from Boston. Transport boats are starting to form up. Some of these guys are thinking that either they're going to die there or they're going to become British prisoners of this particular adventure. Well, news got to the British. Obviously, once they started hearing the cannonading happening, Gage summons his generals for a council of war. What should they do? They realized his plan to simultaneously attack Dorchester Heights and Bunker Hill completely out the window. It's gone. General Clinton urged very, very hard, do not do a frontal assault of this fortification. Take the troops, row them to the actual neck of Charlestown, land them in Charlestown, at the base of the neck, and cut off the troops that are in that fortification. Fight will be over in 30 seconds. Clinton, a lot of times throughout his career, would make correct recommendations for what the British military should do against American tactics. A lot of times he was overridden. This is an example of it. And the bloodshed we're going to see in a little bit could have been avoided if they had listened to Clinton. And I think the outcome of the siege of Boston probably would have been a lot different if they had listened to Clinton. He was overruled by the other three generals. Basically, they chastised him, saying you violated a maxim of military tactics where they said, listen, you never put your troops between two enemy bodies. The troops on the hill in the fortification and the troops behind the siege line in Cambridge. Because on the other side of Charlestown Neck is Cambridge. So he got overridden. General Howe believed that basically this should be an easy, casual ascent up the hill, and they could easily take the fortification. And General Burgoyne, who suffered from his own ego and arrogance, and he eventually learned the lesson at the Saratoga campaign, basically concluded that, listen, the soldiers that are inside that redoubt are untrained rabble, and that they would collapse under trained troops as they were attacking. Well, Back in American headquarters, General Artemus Ward realizes that this situation is escalating very quickly. He realizes now that no reinforcements have come to render assistance to the Americans in the redoubt. The redoubt position is much further than he intended. And he realizes if that fortification falls, the British could keep going and try to punch through through Cambridge, and then basically roll up the entire American siege lines. So what happens is you start seeing these mobilization on two fronts. And the first one is relative to the British mobilization. With the British mobilization, following the Council of War, you basically see, according to American eyewitness, this rapid movement taking place all along the shoreline in Boston, as well as with the Royal Navy, where you just see Royal Navy boats just coming and going as quickly as possible. General Burgoyne noticed that once they got into their transport boats and began to row across to Charlestown, there was no resistance offered to their landing. And again, this goes back to the fact that the artillery that they did have was very limited. There were snipers in position, which we'll talk about in a little bit, but the British were still out of range. And of course, according to another account, a British officer stated that on the 17th, the dawn of the day, we found the enemy had pushed entrenchments with great diligence during the night on the heights of Charlestown, and we evidently saw that every hour gave them fresh strength. It therefore became necessary to alter our plan, attacking both hills, and dispatch approximately 2,000 men, which landed on the outward side of the peninsula, covered with shipping without opposition, and the plan was they were going to ascend the hill once they were in formation. So this is Charlestown Neck, or Charlestown. You can see up here where it says American retreat, this is the neck which leads towards Cambridge. The British basically took positions from both Long Wharf as well as near the North Battery, and the first wave swung wide, ultimately landing on the easternmost point of Moulton's Point, where they began to form up. At this particular point, no artillery has been rowed across. These are mainly troops. And there are two types of troops that are going across, well, excuse me, three types of troops that are going across. Grenadiers, light infantry, and Marines. So if you remember from my lecture in the springtime on the Battle of Lexington and Concord, light infantry are your rapid deployment troops. These are the equivalent of almost special forces, rangers, airborne. They will hit an enemy very quickly, roll over them, and try to encircle from behind. Grenadiers, they are shock troops. They're designed to do frontal assaults and frontal attacks. Marines are essentially both categories. So these are the types of troops that are landing at the initial outset. Now, it was roughly, they started rowing across the river approximately between noon and 2 o'clock in the afternoon. They outside of musket range, and they waited for a second wave of soldiers to come over. The reinforcements that were coming over actually landed down near Charlestown. The community of Charlestown was located here, down in the southernmost point of the Charlestown Peninsula. And so as a result, there were positioned troops, mostly Marines, that were located here. Your Grenadiers and your light infantry are generally located to the northernmost point. Prescott basically goes, oh boy. And as a result, he starts adjusting his line of troops. He starts having them stop digging. He starts having them reclaim their weapons, has them start stripping off packs and getting ready for a coming assault. And according to Prescott, he said that the enemy continuing an incessant fire with their artillery until about 2 o'clock in the afternoon, the enemy began to land in a northeasterly point from the fort. Finally, 2 artillery pieces arrive. And he ordered a artillery with 2 pieces to go and oppose them. So in other words, bring the guns out in front of the fortification and start firing on them. And ordered them to start attacking, and he ordered some Connecticut troops to support the artillery. The artillery train decided on their own to go somewhere else. I suspect that they probably moved down closer to Charlestown, the community, but basically he's like, I just lost my artillery. Now this is where things begin to change, at least for the better, for Prescott. And this is where New Hampshire enters the fight. And these were mostly, again, we talk about the relationship with the Merrimack Valley. A lot of these men I'm about to describe come from Rockingham County, which is just to our north. And this is where New Hampshire enters the fight. General Ward, basically, now we're talking about American mobilization, he realized that he needs to get troops to this particular fortification and defend the fortification in the battlefield, because again, if the British punch through the fortification, they are going to be able to attack the American lines in Cambridge, and the entire siege is at risk. So he quickly ordered several regiments down to the battlefield to provide assistance. Among the first were New Hampshire men from Colonel John Stark's regiment. As they approached the narrow Charlestown Neck, the HMS Lively, which is a 20-gun ship, it's about a mid-sized military warship for the Royal Navy at the time, basically swung into line so that all their guns were now bearing on Stark's regiment and opened fire. And they raked them with artillery fire. Well, Stark had a choice at this point. I can say, hey guys, great effort. We did a good job. We all agree we're from New Hampshire. We got to save these Massachusetts boys, but good job, team. Or he could say, hey, we're gonna push forward. He ordered them to push forward. So they are now subjected to artillery fire on this narrow neck. And miraculously, no one was hurt as this entire regiment sprinted across this Royal Navy fire. So again, where they would have sprinted was right up here. They came down to this area to form up. Now, Stark formed a defensive line, and he surveyed what he was looking at. He saw that basically you had the fortification, which was located essentially in the center of the neck, here. And he saw that there was a rail fence that kind of did a wonky L-shaped, that kind of diagonally went up and over to the coastline. And he realized nobody was defending it. There was a small detachment of Connecticut troops that were near the fortification, but that was it. So as a result, he realized that the British, if they advanced, they get to swing wide behind the fortification and take it without a fight. So he deployed his regiment down towards the rail fence, and he positioned himself close to the Mystic River. And they began to fortify the rail fence. And of course, they said they began to stuff it with hay and straw and grass, which we all know is not going to stop a bullet. It was more for camouflaging purposes to sort of throw off the British as they're advancing up the hill. And then he turned to Captain John Moore's company of his regiment and ordered them to go down to the shoreline of the Mystic River, because that rail fence ended where the grass ended, and then there's a 9-foot drop, and is basically shoreline. So once again, the British could send, and they would, light infantry detachments all along that coastline, scale that 8-foot small cliff, if you want to call it, and then just swing behind. And so what he did was they started across, it was about 12 foot wide, was this beach. They started to pile rocks and boulders, typical New England, rocks from typical New England walls, up, and they formed a fortification wall. And then Stark deployed his men 3 ranks deep behind that stone wall for this particular company. There's some debate about how he actually formed them up. He could have formed them all in one line, so there's 3 ranks, so they would fire a massive volley of 3 ranks at them. What I suspect happened was he sent them almost in columns, so you had 3 columns of men. Because there was a drill that's starting to become popular at this time, and I think I talked about it at my last talk by Timothy Pickering, who is a Salem man who wrote a drill manual. He plagiarized from a lot of people, but he did introduce a few things that was really, really neat and kind of cutting edge. And one of the things in his drill manual was how to defend a fortification. And he talks about it that you should have your men not in these battle lines, but instead in columns, where they can each fire, cycle out, go to the rear of the line and reload, and you can almost have this machine gun firing taking place within a company. So I think that's how they basically formed on the beach. Well, at this particular time, troops are actually starting to mobilize onto the field. Elements of regiments also risked the dangers of the particular neck as they were being raked by artillery fire. These troops included Colonels Brewer's regiment, Nixon's regiment, Woodbridge's, Little's, we're going to talk about Little's in just a second, Major Moore's regiment, And finally, a competent artillery commander arrived on the field with a train of artillery named Callender's Company of Artillery. He actually defied his colonel. His colonel ordered him not to cross the neck. He basically said, "Watch me," and proceeded to go across the neck with his artillery train. And it was at this time that one particular gentleman volunteer arrived as well. And that was the president of the Massachusetts Provincial Congress and recently appointed Major General Joseph Warren. Joseph Warren, the best way I could give you for analogy, he was beloved by his troops. He was beloved by people from Massachusetts. Again, referencing my mother loved JFK, so I would probably give the same analogy. This is a politician you want on the battlefield, okay? That'll be my only political comment for the day. By him arriving on the battlefield, and they offered him command immediately. They said, "Listen, you're the highest ranking person on this field. Do you want command?" He said, "No, I'm here to serve with these other men here. I'm going to fight side by side with them." It just bolstered their morale at this particular time that this rock star just arrived and he wants to be amongst the people. It really had a brief morale effect. Very, very powerful. Well, with it, I mentioned Little's regiment. Little's regiment is tied to Newburyport. Moses Little, his regiment was formed in May of 1775. It was an offshoot of Garish's regiment, which was from Newbury mostly, which we'll talk about that in a few minutes. But Little's regiment had 2 companies of Newburyport men. And these 2 companies of Newburyport men are racing across the neck to get into the fight, and most likely took up some position along that rail fence. And according to the letter from Mr. Bromfield, General Ward ordered without delay several regiments down to their assistance, and 2 companies belonging to the town of the rest of Misters Lunt, and Captain Lunt and Captain Perkins. They later received the orders. They marched down with all possible expedition and found that the regulars were starting to land at the base of Charlestown, and they actually then pressed on and ultimately engaged the enemy. And they bravely marched to their assistance and was of eminent service. So already the regiment was coming across under fire. They see the British landing, and the Newburyporters say, "We're going." And they proceeded to press forward. Now, there's this weird phenomenon, just as a side note, that took place during this time. If you remember Paul Revere's Midnight Ride and William Dawes and so forth, how they went out to the countryside that said the British, the regulars are coming. Well, the Committee of Safety realized, as General Ward's fear, that if the British punch through, this siege is over. So the Committee of Safety dispatched a whole bunch of alarm riders to Middlesex County, Norfolk County, and Essex County and said, if you are within a couple of hours march of Cambridge, you need to mobilize your militia companies now and have them march towards Cambridge to shore up the American siege lines. Basically, it became known, Boston National Park calls this the Bunker Hill Alarm. One of the companies that actually participated in the Bunker Hill Alarm was Captain John Parker's Lexington Company, the same company that was decimated at the Battle of Lexington. He was able to muster roughly about, I think it was 64 men. They were able to mobilize. They pretty much double timed it down to Cambridge and man the siege lines. Now we have to talk about Samuel Garish. Is anyone from Newbury? I'm sorry. This is not going to be good for you guys. Colonel Samuel Garish is an interesting character. Colonel Garish raised a regiment in May of 1775. And his is a unique regiment because you do have elements of like Newbury, Ipswich, Raleigh that are part of his regiment, which makes sense. He's going around to community towns. But he was also recruiting in Woburn, Lexington, and Billerica. So a lot of the veterans of the Battle of Lexington were in his regiment. And so what happened was Colonel Samuel Garish's regiment was raised in May of 1775, and it was designated the 25th Massachusetts Regiment of the Massachusetts Grand Army. Almost instantly, the regiment, a lot of officers complained about this guy. I've seen accounts of British intelligence reports where they say, this guy's a moron. He is a political hack. How the heck did he become a colonel? And ultimately, several of his captains rebel against him and say they petitioned the Massachusetts Provincial Congress for permission to break away and form a second regiment, get away from this guy. And the person who was leading that charge was Moses Little, who's led his men onto the battlefield and has them in line ready to repel the British. The Provincial Congress let that happen, so as a result, Garish's regiment was severely decimated. He had to go back out and do some more recruiting. For some reason, he suckered a lot of people from Raleigh to come in and field with him. And as a side note, as we're going to see, ultimately, General Washington, when he learned of Garish's behavior leading up to Bunker Hill and during Bunker Hill, despised the man. When General Ward ordered his troops to reinforce the American lines, Garish's regiment mobilized. And they arrived, and they actually, it looks like they were able to cross Charlestown Neck. However, rather than go directly to the redoubt, they started marching down towards Charlestown. And they immediately became under fire from the Royal Navy that's anchored off of Charlestown. Major Lomi Baldwin, who would become an amazing colonel, particularly in 1776 at the Battle of Trenton, he was the second in command of the regiment. And he basically said that they came under heavy fire. He said, I went with the recruits and we met men at the fort breastwork where there was a great number of cannon shots struck near me, but they were not suffered to hurt me. So cannon artillery is going all around him. Now, this is an example of grape shot. Grape shot has one purpose. They are basically golf-sized cannonballs that are fired shotgun style out of a cannon to take out as many infantry troops as possible. By the time Garish and his men are starting to cross the Charlestown Neck, the Royal Navy is switching from large cannonballs to grape shot. They are trying to mow down as many men as possible to stop them from crossing the neck. Well, there's a 19th century pension account from a Lexington militiaman, patriot of color, named Silas Perdue. I was ready to say Eli, his cousin. He talks about how they made it across the neck and they came under the fire of grape shot. The regiment took up a line of march for Bunker Hill in Charlestown, and Captain Wood's company, which was part of Garish's regiment, proceeded as far as the Charlestown Common, which means they're down by the town. And then suddenly they received several volleys of cannon and grape shot. After the American troops, basically they fled. They broke and ran. The men actually retreated back across the neck and retired to Prospect Hill in Cambridge. So Garish's regiment is already starting to fall apart. Well, when Colonel Garish sees the grape shot being fired at his men and they're coming under fire and some of the men are being hit and now they're taking casualties, he is overcome with fear. And according to at least one period account, a letter that was written from Newburyport, a tremor seized Garish. He began to bellow, retreat, retreat, or you all be cut off. At which point they so confused and scared our men that they retreated most precipitously. Another account, according to Israel Putnam, says that General Garish began to flop on the ground. He just fell to the ground screaming, retreat, retreat, retreat. And Putnam is horrified. Putnam is now riding back and forth on a horse, trying to get these reinforcements, directing them rather than go down to Charlestown to get to the fortification of the rail fence. He pleads with Garish to lead his troops. Putnam threatened him. At one point, he beat Garish with the flat of his sword. He cursed and swore at men. Garish's regiment broke and ran, unfortunately. There is only Christian Faberger, who was actually a Swedish immigrant, who was the regiment's adjutant. He was able to get about 2 dozen men and lead them across the neck and join the fight. That's all that came from Garish's regiment. So my apologies to Newbury. At least you're not Amesbury. Now with Charlestown, Charlestown suddenly becomes a focal point of the British troops. As the British troops are landing, suddenly their attention is drawn to Charlestown. Partially because troops are starting to march down to that location, but there's another pressing issue. General Howe, his initial plan was going to be, a two-prong attack. First one, under the command of Robert Piggott, would advance directly towards the redoubt as a feint. However, the second attack under the direction of Howe would basically go along the Mystic River, along a pasture, and basically flank around behind the fortification and attack the Americans in their position. Major John Pitcairn, who was second in command at the Battle of Lexington for the British forces, would hold the Marines in reserve. As Howe is preparing this attack on the shores of Charlestown, his men are starting to get picked off by sniper fire from Charlestown. So as a result, Howe is prepared for this. He sends orders to Admiral Graves. Admiral Graves is instructed to burn Charlestown. Now, Charlestown at this particular point is partially abandoned. Many of the residents of the town, after Lexington and Concord, abandoned the community because they're a forward point in the American siege lines. They're in between the British lines and the American lines. But there are still a lot of people who are here. Well, Admiral Graves has no love for New Englanders. He has no love for Charlestown. He had already been heating up hotshot and preparing other materials to start lobbing at Charlestown to burn it. And what essentially happens is they open fire, and because Charlestown is mostly wooden structures, it catches fire very quickly. General Burgoyne, who was watching from Boston, was actually saddened to see Charlestown being torched. He said, "Straight before us, a large and noble town in one great blaze. The church steeples of being of timber were great pyramids of fire above the rest." There was a broadside, if you go back to, hang on, I apologize. There was a broadside, it was in my Charlestown burning slide a couple of slides ago. There's a broadside that describes the fate of the Charlestown residents. The town was wantonly and inhumanely set on fire and consumed previous to the engagement. This town contained one large meeting house, about 300 houses, and a great number which were elegant. A lot of merchants from Boston would ultimately go over and actually set up homes in Charlestown before this destruction. There was also 152 other buildings, warehouses, merchant shops, etc., whereby about 600 or 700 of the inhabitants are now forced from their dwellings and have basically become homeless. So what I'd like to share with you now is there's 3 contemporary drawings that I'm aware of that depict the burning of Charlestown. One of them is actually known, the other 2 may not be known. I've recently had them shared with them. This is actually a close-up. You can see a Royal Navy ship that is firing into Charlestown. Over here, you have British artillery that's starting to set up position. You have British officers who are commanding here that are getting ready to attack the fortification. This is from a 1775 print that's called An Exact View of the Late Battle of Charlestown, which depicts the burning of Charlestown. This next one we think might have been drawn contemporaneously with the battle. This is Thomas Davies, who is a British officer. Original sketch of the burning of Charlestown and the Battle of Bunker Hill, taken by an English officer from Beacon Hill in Boston. As you can see here, down here, Charlestown is on fire. You can see over here the Royal Navy opening fire on the American position. Same here. You can actually see the Royal Navy transporting troops across. And then finally, this was drawn, I believe it was late 1775. This is the aftermath of Charlestown, the remnants of Charlestown. It was by Richard Williams, who was another British officer. He entitled this The Burnt Ruins of Charlestown from Across Charles River. As you can see, all that's left of Charlestown in the aftermath of the battle is nothing but burnt out houses the entire way along. Now, one of the other phenomenons that we did have during this time, Massachusetts was heavily deforested. So as a result, many hillsides around Boston proper were filled with spectators who were watching the battle. In Boston, General Burgoyne actually noted, "Behind us in church steeples and heights of our own camps covered with spectators of the rest of our army, which was not engaged, and the hillsides were covered with spectators." One of the 2 spectators who were watching, she couldn't actually see the battle, but she could see Charlestown burning, was Abigail Adams and her son, John Quincy Adams. 22 miles to the north in Andover, Massachusetts, on Holt Hill, residents of Andover were watching the Battle of Bunker Hill, not knowing that Fry's regiment, which their men were from, were inside the redoubt fighting. On top of that, because of deforestation, residents of Exeter, Newburyport, and Amesbury, and other northern Massachusetts and southern New Hampshire communities first heard what they thought was thunder. But they realized eventually they were hearing artillery being fired, so they were actually able to hear the battle fire. And I just recently discovered a early 19th century account, or actually mid-19th century account, where a historian from Amesbury interviewed what would have been a child witness in 1775, and he describes how he was able to hear the artillery exchange in Amesbury. And this was 5-year-old David Currier. David Currier was playing in the Pond Hill district of Amesbury, which is located on the Merrimack-Amesbury line, when he began to hear the distant artillery fire. He didn't realize his father, Captain John Currier, was commanding one of the companies inside the redoubt at this particular time. And he talked about how a panic set in amongst Amesbury residents because they realized there was a fight taking place outside of Boston. And they talked about how it was a warm day with a southwest wind, and the guns were distinctly heard, forcing all to the conclusion that a battle was going on. Never before had the big guns of an enemy been heard at Amesbury. All were wild with fear and excitement. So before we go on, I'm going to have my two models come up as we're talking about the first assault. And I will start talking, and then I'll talk about my two models. I asked them to come up for this talk. So the plan of attack was essentially as I described. The major force was going to be going along the coastline, swing behind the rail fence, and attack the redoubt. There was going to be a feinting movement or a supporting movement of grenadiers that were coming up also towards the rail fence, and then a secondary or diversionary attack that was going to be heading towards the redoubt. He had hoped that, and you guys could come up, they had hoped that artillery crews that he had brought over with his forces would be able to support the attack as they're coming up. However, it was soon discovered that the artillery that was brought over had the wrong ammunition. So the guns were actually useless at this time. Now, General Howe was leading the light infantry companies and the grenadiers in assaulting the American flank along the rail fence. Which makes sense because General Howe actually had developed and trained light infantry troops. So it made sense for him to lead the light infantry attack. And they began to advance in a column. Rather than a battle line, they were coming up in a column. And Howe's grenadiers were moving in support. So Piggott, who was attacking the redoubt, had troops from the 5th, 38th, 43rd, and 47th, and 52nd Regiments and Marines. So before we go on, just real quickly, I want to show you at least what troops would have looked like inside the redoubt. So I'll have these two good-looking gentlemen come forward, and I will talk a little loud at this point. So come on over, gentlemen.
We were just looking around for some good-looking guys.
Yeah.
I've been called a lot of things before, but never a model.
Why don't we give them very handsome men? Okay. Yes.
My pack is in the readout.
Okay, that's fine. And I'm actually glad you did this because of the point. So I'm going to start with Steve. Steve, you can see they're both dressed in civilian clothing. Neither of them have uniforms. They have both frock coats. They are both equipped with military muskets. One is a British infantry musket. One is a French infantry musket. They both have cartridge boxes. It looks like they have some form of edged weapons and canteens. Now, what is interesting is when these troops arrived, so first we'll start with Steve. Steve, if you could turn around. So as you can see, Steve has full campaign gear on. Okay, so he has a knapsack. He also has a blanket as well, which is on a tump line. He would have arrived in the fortification wearing all of this, okay? Because they didn't know, even though they thought they were going to be relieved, they would have had all their campaign gear with them because there was nowhere else to store it when they went out for this particular duty. They were basically bringing their home with them. When they would have arrived at the fortification, the colonel of the various regiments, including Little's, would have ordered Steve, strip off your packs, strip off your blankets, and put them down. So as a result, you can see this gentleman, if you turn around, is without the necessary heavy campaign gear. So he's already started to strip down his gear. On top of that, as you can see, so he's able to move a little bit more, thank you. And so the other thing is, as the battle progresses, Many of the colonels are actually saying, take off the coats. Take off the coats, remove your edged weapons. All you need is your cartridge box and your musket and your canteen. That's it. So what they have here is, first of all, they have a cartridge box. Cartridge box is their ammunition pouch. They would have carried roughly about 19 rounds of ammunition. This is one of the reasons why they ran out of ammunition at the end of the battle. The other problem is these two gentlemen have two different types of muskets. So as a result, they have different caliber weapons, which means his ammunition is different than his ammunition. Okay? So you cannot have a standard form of an ammunition truck just come up and start distributing ammunition at this time. Armed with a bayonet, so it is a socket bayonet. I'm going to pull it out, which is about half the Massachusetts troops had these. They would have been as a bladed weapon that would have been affixed to the end of the musket, at which point it would have become basically serve as a spear. Do you have a bayonet as well?
I do.
You do. So he has a bayonet as well, different type of carrying frog. They also have two different types of canteens. As you can see, this particular individual has a cheese box canteen, and then the other one has what is referred to as a tin canteen, which would have been either from a captured British soldier or maybe a holdover from a earlier war. The big thing, which we'll talk about in a little while, what happens to these guys as they're losing the battle? When they flee from the field, their packs that Steve stripped off, or perhaps if Paul had left behind his bayonet, they're being abandoned. So later in the year, they will submit property claims for reimbursement for what they had. Thank you very much, gentlemen. Oh. Now, the famous thing is, if you've ever heard about the Battle of Bunker Hill, don't fire till you see the whites of their eyes. Where the heck did that come from? Was it actually said? Well, they think that the order was given, or some version of the order was given. Some people think it was Putnam. Other people say it was Stark. Other people say it was Prescott. We don't know, but it could have been a situation where one officer gave the order and then it continued on from there. The phrase is not made up. It actually existed in the 18th century. Historian John Bell, who runs my competitor blog, Boston 1775, said that this was yes, be sure to heckle him if you ever visit his blog. It's a historical nerdery is cooler. And I'm better looking too. But it was, they believed there was a tradition of a Royal Navy. And actually, John Bell found a newspaper account from the 1750s where Royal Navy officers would repeatedly order their men in naval combat hold their fire until they could see the white of their enemy's eyes. So the phrase did exist. And so as a result, it may have been uttered at the Battle of Bunker Hill, but one thing is definitely for sure. The Americans held their fire. And so what happens is, as the British are advancing up this hill, the Americans are holding their fire. Now, when you look at these paintings from the 19th and 20th century, the view is the British have this easy ascent up the hill. It's like a golf course hill, easy walk. That is not the case. Archaeological studies and reviews of maps have actually determined this was an obstacle course these soldiers were going up. The hay on the hillside had not been harvested, so they're going up through waist-deep grass, and it concealed the terrain underneath. And what they've actually determined, according to Boston National Historical Park, there was a web of stone walls. They were hidden by the hay, the waist-high hay. There's rail fences, there's hedges. There's actually even, I'm still trying to figure this out, but there was a marsh on the hill. And so the soldiers actually have to get through all of this and have to halt, get over it, and all the time the Americans are holding their fire. And General Burgoyne later complained that the British troops were admirable going up that hill. And they were exceedingly soldier-like, but they were met with 1,000 impediments of strong fences and were very much exposed. Well, as the head of Howe's light infantry column approaches the position that Stark is behind, the 23rd Regiment of Foot Light Infantry Company is in the advance. They're also known or nicknamed as the Royal Welsh Fusiliers. Stark ordered his men to lie down on the ground, so they're hiding behind that quickly hastened built stone wall along the shoreline, as well as behind all the hay-covered fencing. They waited until they were almost on top of them, probably under 50 feet, at which point they sprung up and they unleashed a unexpected volley directly into the 23rd Regiment of Foot. The volley decimated the 23rd Regiment of Foot's Light Infantry Company. The average light infantry company is about 100 men. 90 men in the 23rd Regiment went down. Okay, that's how deadly this particular fire was. The survivors broke, they panicked, ran, and fled. Well, meanwhile, the 4th Regiment of Foot, which is the second light column behind them, is trying to still press forward. They're going over the wounded and the dead, as well as the fleeing light infantry, and they start to press towards the wall. Again, they were decimated by Stark's firing at this particular point. The remainder of the light infantry broke and ran. They saw what happened, they panicked, and they ran. And they ran all the way down to their assembly point. Well, this is embarrassing for the British authorities. And so they tried to rally the light infantry and have them re-engage. And the intent was they were going to come up behind the grenadiers and support the grenadiers as they're attacking the rail fence as well. Well, the light infantry did get back together. They started to march up behind the grenadiers, and they tried to fire over the grenadiers' heads. Instead, they started firing into the grenadiers. So now you have incidents of friendly fire, of British firing on British. Lieutenant Colonel James Abercrombie, who was mortally wounded at the Battle of Bunker Hill and died a couple of weeks later, he complained that our light infantry killed many of the Grens. After ordering them to stop it, desist, they renewed the firing about 8 to 10 minutes later and gave me a plumper and killed 2 officers and 3 privates. Plumper is 18th century slang for a wall of lead or a musket volley. So you do have accounts of friendly fire taking place. Meanwhile, further along, Abercrombie with his grenadiers is trying to attack the rail fence, and he's getting decimated as well. He's mortally wounded. And then Piggott tries to attack the redoubt, and they are just pouring volleys of fire constantly into them. He falters and has to retreat as well. Meanwhile, as Charlestown is still burning, there are a few stubborn Americans who are still sniping from burning Charlestown. So they're being harassed as they're retreating. Now, here's a real neat thing I came across. If you ever follow my blog, I'm a big fan of child witnesses. These are often 19th century accounts that are written by children or people who witnessed an event of the American Revolution when they were children. And we have an account of Dorothea Gamsby. She was a 10-year-old child loyalist at the Battle of Bunker Hill. She was watching the battle basically on a rooftop in Boston. And she describes the first British attack on the redoubt. And she describes how the glittering host, the crashing music, and all brilliance of war moved up towards the band of rebels, but they still labored at their entrenchment. Every available window and roof was filled with anxious spectators watching the advancing regulars. Every heart, I dare say, throbbed as mine did, and we held our breath. So intensely we awaited the expected attack, but the troops drew nearer and nearer, and the rebels toiled on. At length, one who stood conspicuously above the rest waved his bright weapon. The explosion came, attended by the crash, the shrieks of the wounded, and the groans of the dying. I screamed with all my might. The real crazy thing about the horror of this that you see, but one thing that stands out, she describes an American officer standing on the redoubt signaling to fire. That's Colonel William Prescott. According to Prescott's own accounts, he was standing on the redoubt to inspire his men to stay and fight. She's recounting seeing Prescott giving the order to fire from the redoubt. So there's a second attack. The British officers retire back down to their assembly point and go, all right, we got a little bit of a job here. And they decide to take a second attack. They said, listen, the main attack is going to go directly towards the redoubt. We're going to push our grenadiers and we're going to push our infantry towards the main attack. We are going to send the light infantry again towards the rail offense. They are going to be a secondary attack. Piggott was in charge of the assault on the redoubt. Howe would again lead the attack on the rail fence. The regulars formed on the field and marched out again. But think about now the additional obstacles. All the obstacles I described to you, now there's dead bodies everywhere. So now they have to navigate to get over their fallen comrades as well. Now, additional troops are still pouring in. Connecticut troops under the command of Lieutenant Charles Nolan ordered his men to hold their fire until the enemy came within 15 rods. It's under 50 yards to their position. Again, Prescott ordered his men to hold their fire. Others ordered to hold their fire as well. From an eyewitness account that came in, spectators watched as the second attack took place. According to one civilian eyewitness account, there was a large orange flash, like a continual sheet of lightning across the redoubt, followed by an uninterrupted peal of thunder. The rebel fire, once again, it was like cutting down grass. Just they tore right into the regulars. The enemy advanced. They tried to make a stand this time. They tried to exchange fire with the fortifications, but they could not keep up. Prescott realizes in the middle of the second firefight, we're starting to run out of ammunition. Ultimately, the soldiers broke and ran again. They retreated out of range of the American position. Same way along the rail fence, Howe's men are cut down again. A British officer would later describe the casualty rates of the Battle of Bunker Hill. He said, most of our grenadiers and light infantry, the moment presenting themselves, some companies lost 3/4 of their men, many 9/10. Some had only 8 or 9 men left to accompany. British broke and ran, and they reassembled. By this time, they're starting to ferry the dead and wounded across to Boston. And Dorothea Gamsby, our child witness, once again says, by carts in every description and vehicle, the British are trying to get their hands on to meet the wounded as they're coming into Boston. She started to see the loads of the wounded attended by long lines of soldiers. There is nothing but woe and shame to be found in this reality. So now the wounded are starting to come into the community, and the civilian population is to see the horrors of this particular fight. There's a big debate that's now going on with the British infantry and the British artillery and the officers. Do we attack again, or do we press forward? And it goes back and forth, and Howe is determined to take this redoubt. He's determined to take this fortification. And as a result, there's going to be one final attack. It is going to be on the redoubt itself. He also sent instructions for the Royal Navy to pretty much start directing fire onto the redoubt to soften it up. Basically, Howe sends General Clinton in Boston to come over with reinforcements. He comes over with 400 men from the 2nd Battalion of Marines, as well as the 63rd Regiment of Foot. He also finds some of the wounded that have been transported over to Boston. He convinces them somehow to return to the fight. I wouldn't have. I'd be like, I'm sorry, I got this scratch here, I'm all set. Inside the redoubt, there's a mix. Initially, the men are elated because they realize we've driven back 2 attacks and we've decimated the enemy. But they've got 3 issues at this particular point. Most importantly, the reinforcements have stopped coming across. The Royal Navy is pounding the neck. No more reinforcements are coming across. Secondly, you're starting to see, even though they've been successful in the first 2 attacks, they have essentially, they know they're running out of ammunition, and many men are starting to desert. And then finally, ammunition. General Ward is desperately trying to find troops to send over, but many regiments are refusing. Garish wasn't the only one, but there are other regiments that refused to cross the neck because of the continuous bombardment. So as a result, the attack is, Howe launches the attack. Everything is being directed towards the redoubt. Once again, they're initially met with a heavy volley. Heavy volley. And again, the British are being cut down. However, subsequent firing they start becoming sporadic. Then there's dead silence, and then they start seeing rocks and dirt being thrown out of the fortification to try and repel the British. The British at this point become enraged. They've already fixed bayonets, as Paul was kind enough to demonstrate fixing of a bayonet on a musket, and they surged forward with a blood-curdling roar. They ran up the redoubt walls and into the redoubt. Prescott would later report that our ammunition being nearly exhausted could only keep up a scattering fire. The enemy being numerous surrounded our little fort and began to mount our lines and enter the forts with their bayonets. We were obliged to retreat through them while they kept up a hot as fire as possible. Because we had very few bayonets, we could make no resistance. Any fighting that was hand-to-hand was usually bayonet versus sword, bayonet versus club of musket, but there is heavy fighting inside the redoubt at this particular point. He talks that through the 3 attacks, they were able to hold the fortification for roughly 90 minutes. According to our friend that goes on. They talk about how heavy the fighting was. Mercy is not being given inside the fortification. Trying to surrender, the British are bayoneting you or shooting you. They start stripping off, Americans start stripping off their muskets, their equipment, their gear, their coats. They're just trying to get off the battlefield as quickly as possible. Militiaman Peter Brown would later describe how lucky he was. He described how the arrows of death flew thick around me. I was preserved while others were suffered to fall prey to our cruel fate. Now, regarding Newburyport, Little's regiment was one of the regiments that covered the retreat as the Americans are coming off the fortification. According to John Bromfield's letter, Newburyport Captain Perkins behaved quite admirably. Even he was firing his officer's fusil until he ran out of ammunition, and having some loose powder in his pocket, he was required to tear off some of his clothing to serve as wadding for his musket balls, and fired away until he was completely out of ammunition, and he retreated without his hat or wig. He lost some of his other equipment as he retreated off the field, but he survived. Served admirably. Bromfield also reported some of the privates who, or others in the regiment from Newburyport who performed admirably. A Stephen Jenkins behaved with equal valor and got himself much honor as Lieutenant Whittemore, who got a flesh wound in a thigh. Another man in the same company, Perkins' company, was killed. Two regulars at once were shot, and one of them was able to escape. Colonel Moses Little also received great praise for his covering action as the troops were trying to withdraw. He said that basically, as they were fighting a rear guard, they saw off in the distance two regiments that could have supported them in covering the retreat, but refused to cross the neck because they were afraid. The tough thing in the final moments of General Warren, General Warren was one of the last ones inside the redoubt, and he was one of the more notable deaths at the Battle of Bunker Hill. As the British are coming into the redoubt, he has dropped his gun and he is parrying off British bayonets with his officer's sword, which is a very light, ineffective weapon. Sadly, he was shot in the head and he was killed. In 2011, a historian and surgeon, Dr. Samuel Foreman, who's also a member of the Lexington Minutemen, was able to do a forensic study of Joseph Warren's skull based upon various images that were taken by Masonic societies. He was able to come to the conclusion, his forensic analysis is that Warren was either killed by a pistol or an officer's fusil, who was most likely an officer shot and killed Warren. His body was stripped of all its clothing. He was bayoneted. Was unrecognizable, and then he was shoved into a shallow ditch just outside the fortification. British Captain Walter Lawrie would later say he stuffed the scoundrel with another rebel into one hole, and he and his seditious principles may remain. Heck of a guy. At the same time, Major John Pitcairn fell. John Pitcairn was, as the battle ended, he was mortally wounded. There is some debate who shot him. If you hear the famous Patriots of Color, either Peter Salem or Salem Poor. Peter Salem was from Framingham. Salem Poor was from Andover. They are both credited with shooting and killing Pitcairn. Problem is Pitcairn suffered from multiple gunshot wounds, so we'll never know who actually killed him. But as he lay dying on the battlefield, he was in the arms of one of his sons. His last dying words were that the Americans started the Battle of Lexington. Yeah. In the aftermath of the fight, the defeated New England forces made a mad dash towards the Charlestown Neck, constantly stripping gear, stripping equipment, and they are being raked by the Royal Navy with that grape shot. It isn't like, okay, we took the field, now let them go. They are being decimated as they're trying to cross. They'll cast aside a lot of the equipment that you saw Paul and Steve wearing. They're just being tossed aside so they can lighten their load and get across that field. It was a massive, it was a victory for the British, but it was at a massive, massive cost. The total casualties for the Battle of Bunker Hill for the British was 1,054 casualties out of roughly 2,200 men. 226 dead, 828 wounded, most with a disproportion of those being officers. A total of over 100 British officers were taken out, either killed or wounded in the battle. That represented almost a 50% casualty rate. It is still to this day, per capita, the bloodiest battle for the British Army. And this is including World War I, per capita. General Clinton remarked that a few more such victories would have shortly put an end to the British dominion in America. Now, relative to Joseph Warren, the British were not done with him. According to John Adams, in a letter, in the days after the Battle of Bunker Hill, officers from the sloop Scorpion, which was heavily involved in the Battle of Bunker Hill and the burning of Charlestown, sent officers where they dug up Warren's body and desecrated the body. According to John Adams, in a day or two after, the officers went up upon the hill, again opened up the dirt that was thrown over the doctor. Warren, he spit in Warren's face, jumped up and down on Warren's stomach, and then committed every act of violence on his body, including decapitating Warren's head. The overall consequences of Bunker Hill, the casualties alarmed the military establishment. American casualties were significantly lower, in the hundreds. They basically, you figure that the British would then sue for peace given the level of decimation. However, King George's and Parliament's attitude towards the American colonies actually hardened and determined that they were going to reject the Congress's olive branch petition, which was sent in the aftermath of Bunker Hill, and turn towards the British states for mercenary troops as well. General George Washington arrived in Cambridge took command of the Continental Army. Ward received some negative press as a result of Bunker Hill, and it was not a contributing factor towards removal and replacement by Washington. And Washington did recognize that, and did, because he recognized Ward's ability towards logistical planning, had a role for him in the new Continental Army. Oops. General Gage, because of the Battle of Bunker Hill, was recalled, and he was basically fired as the overall military commander in North America and the governor of Massachusetts. General Howe would assume command. However, as a result of Bunker Hill, fights, particularly during the New York campaign, he would never attack a fortified American position again. And he was very reluctant when the Americans took Dorchester Heights. He was reluctantly going to lead an attack against Dorchester Heights, but a nor'easter came in, and he ultimately decided that he was going to attack, he was going to withdraw from Boston instead. Just some quick reflections on the fight from Newburyport's perspective. 2 Newburyport men in their journals made note of the Battle of Bunker Hill in the aftermath. Moses Sleeper, who was in Captain Perkins' company. A couple of days, he wrote in his journal that on Saturday the 17th, 1775, the regulars came out upon the back of Charlestown and set fire to it and burnt it down, and came to our, I think it was meant to be entrenchments, forced it with the loss of 896 regulars and about 50 of ours. Casualties were higher. Americans sustained roughly about 400 casualties. Basically, the fire held until about, they began about 3 o'clock and held till 6. Sergeant Paul Lunt of Captain Ezra Lunt's company, also of Newburyport, described that the regulars landed a number of engaged them. They drove us off the hill and burnt Charlestown. Dr. Warren was lost in the battle. The siege lasted about 3 hours. They killed about 50 of our men, wounded about 80. They killed the King's troops, 896, 92 officers, 104 sergeants. So these again are reflections. I see a lot of Massachusetts and Connecticut and New Hampshire soldiers. It's not very detailed long letters like Bromfield wrote to a friend. It's just memorializing what happened, and this is what we went through. But as the final comment for tonight, and then I will shut up, I do want to finish with a reflection by Sergeant Francis Merrifield of Ipswich, who did serve in Little's regiment. This is his journal over here. It is currently in the Museum of the American Revolution down in Philadelphia. He was a sergeant in Nathaniel Wade's company of Colonel Little's regiment at the Battle of Bunker Hill, and he made an inscription in his journal that sort of reflects upon what Peter Brown also said, where he said, "The arrows of death were all around me, yet somehow I survived." And this is another soldier who basically, I think, with a little bit of reflection and probably a lot of PTSD, was like, oh my God, I'm really lucky that I got out of this bloodbath. And he said in the aftermath, he wrote, and I say journal, I apologize, it was his Bible. He said, in Cambridge, June 17, 1775, I desire to bless God for his kind appearance in delivering me and sparing my life in the late battle fought at. I desire to devote this spared life to his glory and honor. In witness my hand, Francis Merrifield. So with that, ladies and gentlemen, that is the Battle of Bunker Hill in Newburyport's role. Thank you very much. As my last lecture, I will remind, I listened to Whitesnake an awful lot in high school. It destroyed my hearing. So if you have questions, please, I would just ask you to speak loud. I'm not sure if you're going to have are you going to repeat questions or?
Sure. Can you also repeat the question?
All right, fine, I'll repeat the questions.
Well, as you understand them.
Yes, ma'am.
Thank you.
Do you want me to listen and repeat?
She's that tall and can take me, so I'm not about to screw with her. Questions?
Go ahead.
They only gave the soldiers 19 bullets. How long did they expect the battle to last?
That's an excellent question. The question was, the soldiers were issued 19 rounds. How long did they think the battle was going to last? I think they thought maybe one assault, maybe two most, and they didn't think that, from the accounts I've read on the American side, they thought after the second assault, we're almost out of ammunition, but hopefully the British have realized we've whipped them good, and they're not going to fight, and we can hold on, and then bring up some ammunition. There is also, on top of that, 19 rounds is the dream amount of ammunition. A lot of men who were in that redoubt only had 4 or 5 rounds, so they were running out pretty quickly. So, other questions? Yes, sir.
I have two questions, or one question of reflection. So you mentioned about a council of war,
Yes.
the British.
Yep.
Where did they do that? Was there a building or something?
Where was the British Council of War?
So the question was, when the British held the Council of War, where would have been held? That is an excellent question. It could have been a couple of locations. There was a governor's mansion at the time, so it could have been in the governor's mansion. Council of War could have also been held around Copp's Hill, which is in the north end, where they're actually looking at the American fortifications. That would probably be my two guesses. The tough thing is with British, when they say in their orders headquarters, unlike the Americans, when they would say headquarters, they then said Cambridge or Watertown. A lot of times the British was just headquarters Boston, and they didn't give the specific location. But you had a follow-up question, sir.
The other reflection, I think I heard the other day on NPR or something, Ken Burns is talking about his show coming up. And there was the discussion about when Washington came after the fact, that he was told that there was that the Massachusetts military, the forces, that there were a number of black folks in it.
Yes.
And his reaction initially was, he's a Virginia, he wasn't in support of that, but then he learned that they fought really hard and really, passionately,
Yep.
and changed his attitude, which I thought was kind of interesting.
It is. That's an excellent point, and I want to touch upon that just for a few minutes. There was over 100 Patriot. That was the question. So the question was basically referencing General Washington when he arrived to take command